On the crowded docks of Port Royal, where cutthroats and merchants haggled over stolen goods, Captain Blackwood Sterling had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and cold calculation. No quarter given, no mercy shown. But when a small hand tugged at his weathered coat and a trembling voice whispered, "I can't find my mommy, can you help me?" the most feared pirate in the Caribbean found himself staring into the tear-filled eyes of a lost child. The busy harbor fell silent as hardened sailors watched their captain, a man who'd sent dozens to watery graves, gently take the little girl's hand. What started as a simple search through the maze of taverns and merchant stalls would lead Blackwood to a beautiful widow whose grateful smile would shatter every wall he'd built around his heart. But can a man who lives by the throes truly find redemption in love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The child's tiny fingers clutched a torn blue ribbon, the silk frayed and stained with tears. Captain Blackwood Sterling found himself in unfamiliar territory as he knelt to the little girl's eye level, his massive frame dwarfing her delicate form. Around them, the Port Royal marketplace buzzed with activity, but conversations had quieted as word spread that the notorious pirate was speaking gently to a lost child. "What's your name, little one?" Blackwood's voice, usually commanding enough to silence a mutinous crew, softened to barely above a whisper. "Emma," she hiccuped, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Emma Hartwell. My mommy said to stay close, but there were so many people, and I got scared." Blackwood studied the ribbon more carefully. The quality of the silk suggested modest means but careful taste. This wasn't the child of a tavern wench or common street vendor. "Tell me about your mother, Emma. What does she look like?" "She's pretty," Emma said, her lower lip trembling. "She has hair like mine, but longer, and she wears a blue dress. She's been very sad since Papa went to heaven." The captain's weathered hands, scarred from countless battles, carefully retied the ribbon in Emma's dark curls. His crew watched from a distance, bewildered by their captain's transformation. These were men who had followed Blackwood Sterling through storms and battles, who had seen him face down naval squadrons without flinching, yet here he was, fussing over a child's hair ribbon like a nursemaid. "A blue dress," Blackwood repeated thoughtfully. He stood slowly, his mind already calculating the most efficient search pattern. "And you said your name is Hartwell. That's not a common name in these parts." Emma nodded vigorously. "Mommy came here to work. She can sew anything beautiful. She made this dress herself." The child twirled, showing off a simple but well-constructed garment that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Blackwood's first mate, a grizzled veteran named Connor Walsh, approached cautiously. Walsh had served under the captain for 8 years and had never seen him show interest in anything beyond profit and reputation. "Captain," he said carefully, "the tide turns in 2 hours. The men are wondering about our departure plans." "The tide can wait," Blackwood replied without taking his eyes off Emma. "We have more pressing matters." Walsh's eyebrows shot up, but he knew better than to question his captain's orders directly. Instead, he gestured toward the busy market square. "Where do you want to start looking, sir?" Blackwood lifted Emma onto his shoulders, ignoring the gasps from nearby merchants who had never imagined the feared pirate captain carrying a child. From her elevated position, Emma could see over the crowds that had previously blocked her view. "Look for a woman in blue," Blackwood called to his crew. "Someone who works with needle and thread. Check the seamstress shops first, then the boarding houses." As they moved through the market, Emma chatted about her mother, unknowingly providing valuable information. Isabella Hartwell was a widow who had recently arrived in Port Royal. She worked for Mrs. Patterson at the dress shop near the harbor. She could read and write in 3 languages, which Emma thought was normal, but Blackwood recognized as highly unusual for a common seamstress. "Mummy tells me stories about faraway places," Emma continued, her small hands tangled in Blackwood's long black hair. "She knows about ships and stars and how to find your way when you're lost." This detail caught Blackwood's attention. Navigation skills were rare, among women of any social class. Combined with the quality of Emma's clothing and her mother's apparent education, a picture was forming of a woman who was much more than he to be. They reached Miss Patterson's dress shop as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Through the window, Blackwood could see several women bent over their sewing, their faces hidden by the dim interior lighting. Emma pressed her nose to the glass, scanning the workers eagerly.
"I don't see her,"
Emma whispered, disappointment heavy in her voice. Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 50s, emerged from the shop wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression changed from annoyed to terrified when she recognized the notorious captain. "Captain Sterling," she stammered. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Isabella Hartwell," Blackwood said simply. "Her daughter has been separated from her." Mrs. Patterson glanced nervously at Emma, then back at the pirate. "Isabella left an hour ago to deliver some finished work to the boarding house on Harbour Street. She mentioned stopping at the market afterward." Blackwood nodded his thanks and turned toward Harbour Street, Emma still perched on his shoulders like a tiny figurehead. Behind them, his crew followed at a respectful distance, still trying to understand this unprecedented display of compassion from their ruthless captain. The boarding house on Harbour Street bustled with the evening crowd as merchants and sailors sought rooms for the night. Blackwood Sterling moved through the narrow corridors with Emma still on his shoulders, following the sound of a woman's voice speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They found Isabella Hartwell in the boarding house's small parlor, speaking with the proprietor about overdue payments. She stood with her back straight despite the obvious stress in her voice, her dark hair pulled back in a simple but elegant style. The blue dress Emma had described fit perfectly, well made but showing signs of careful mending. When Isabella turned and saw her daughter perched on the shoulders of the most feared pirate in the Caribbean, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Fear, confusion, and overwhelming relief battled for dominance. Isabella rushed forward, her hands reaching up to lift her daughter down, but she stopped short when she met Blackwood's dark eyes, suddenly aware of who held her child. "Mommy?" Emma scrambled down from Blackwood's shoulders and hewed herself into her mother's arms. "I got lost, but the nice pirate man helped me find you." Isabella held Emma tightly, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her modest neckline, hung a thin gold chain. Whatever pendant it held was tucked safely away, but Blackwood's experienced eye caught the glint of something precious being deliberately hidden. "I cannot thank you enough," Isabella said carefully, her voice cultured and precise. "I was terrified when I realized she had wandered off." Blackwood found himself studying her face with unusual interest. Isabella Hartwell possessed a natural beauty that needed no enhancement, but it was her eyes that held his attention. They showed intelligence, strength, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Not fear exactly, but the wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious. "No thanks necessary," Blackwood replied, surprised by how much he meant it. Any decent man would have done the same. Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly at his word. The reputation of Captain Blackwood Sterling was well known throughout the Caribbean, and decent was not a term typically associated with his name. Yet here he stood, having spent his afternoon searching for a lost child with no expectation of reward. "Nevertheless, I am in your debt," Isabella said formally. "If there is any way I can repay your kindness." "There is no debt," Blackwood insisted, but something in her manner made him pause. "Though I confess curiosity about how a seamstress comes to speak with such refinement, or how her daughter knows so much about navigation and distant lands." A shadow crossed Isabella's face, and she instinctively pulled Emma closer. "We have traveled extensively," she said vaguely. "One learns much from travel." The proprietor of the boarding house, a nervous man named Henderson, had been watching this exchange with growing anxiety. Having a notorious pirate captain in his establishment was bad for business, but he didn't dare ask such a dangerous man to leave. "Mr. Hartwell," Henderson interrupted, "about the matter we were discussing. The room rate is due. and I'm afraid I cannot extend credit indefinitely." Isabella's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I understand, Mr. Henderson. I should have the full amount by week's end." Blackwood's jaw tightened as he witnessed Isabella's humiliation. Without hesitation, he reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. "How much does she owe?" "Captain Sterling, I cannot accept," Isabella began, but Blackwood was already counting coins into Henderson's eager palm. "Consider it payment for services rendered," Blackwood said smoothly. "Your daughter provided excellent navigation assistance during our search." Emma giggled at this, charmed by being treated as a valuable crew member. Isabella looked between her daughter and the pirate captain, clearly struggling with accepting charity while understanding she had little choice. "This is too generous," Isabella said quietly. "I will find a way to repay you. Perhaps you would allow me to escort you and Emma safely back to your lodgings," Blackwood offered. "The streets of Port Royal can be dangerous after dark, especially for a woman alone." Isabella glanced around the boarding house parlor, noting the rough characters who frequented such establishments. Henderson had already pocketed the gold and was eyeing Isabella with new interest, clearly calculating how much more he might extract from her mysterious benefactor. "That would be most kind," Isabella agreed, lifting Emma into her arms. As they walked through the darkening streets of Port Royal, Blackwood found himself matching his usual brisk pace to Isabella's more measured steps. Emma chatted happily between them, treating the fearsome pirate captain like an old family friend. Several times Blackwood caught Isabella studying him with those intelligent eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When they reached the small room Isabella rented above a bakery, she turned to face him fully. "Captain Sterling, I meant what I said about repaying your kindness. Perhaps there is some service I could provide. I am skilled with needle and thread, and I can read and write in several languages." Blackwood considered her offer carefully. There was something about Isabella Hartwell that intrigued him beyond her obvious beauty. Her education, her careful speech, the way she carried herself despite her current circumstances, all suggested a woman with secrets worth discovering. 3 days passed before Captain Blackwood Sterling found himself standing outside Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, holding a torn sail and feeling oddly uncertain. He had faced down naval squadrons and rival pirates without hesitation, yet approaching a seamstress shop to speak with Isabella Hartwell required more courage than he cared to admit. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Mrs. Patterson looked up from her ledger with barely concealed alarm. "Captain Sterling, how may we assist you?" "I require mending services," Blackwood said, holding up the sail. "I was told Isabella Hartwell wears exceptional skill with needle and thread." Isabella emerged from the back room, her arms full of finished garments. When she saw Blackwood, a smile crossed her face before she could suppress it. "Captain Sterling, what brings you to our establishment?" "This sail was damaged in our last engagement," he explained, spreading the heavy canvas on the counter. "My usual sailmaker is unavailable." Isabella examined the tier with professional interest, running her fingers along the frayed edges. "This will require careful work. The weave is complex and any weakness could prove dangerous in a storm." Blackwood watched her hands as she assessed the damage, noting their delicacy despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Can it be repaired properly?" "It can be made stronger than it was originally," Isabella replied confidently. "But it will take time. Perhaps 3 days." "I have 3 days," Blackwood said, though his ship was ready to sail with the morning tide. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat nervously. "Isabella, perhaps you should discuss the price with the captain." Before Isabella could speak, the shop door burst open, and Emma ran inside, her face bright with excitement. She had been playing in the small courtyard behind the building while her mother worked. "Captain Blackwood." Emma threw herself at his legs with the fearless affection of childhood. "Are you going on another adventure?" Blackwood found himself smiling as he lifted Emma up. From his coat pocket, he produced a small wooden compass, its brass face polished to a golden shine. The compass rose was carved with intricate detail, each point marked with tiny symbols that seemed to dance in the light. "This is for you," he said, placing it in Emma's small hands. So you'll never be lost again. Emma's eyes widened with wonder as she turned the compass, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north. It's beautiful. Look, Mommy, it shows which way is which. Isabella stepped closer to examine the gift, her breath catching when she recognized the craftsmanship. Captain, this is far too valuable. I cannot allow Emma to accept such an expensive gift. Nonsense, Blackwood replied. A navigator needs proper tools, and Emma has shown herself to be quite capable in that regard. Emma beamed at being called a navigator, immediately beginning to test the compass by walking in different directions and watching the needle respond. Isabella watched her daughter's joy with mixed emotions, clearly torn between gratitude and concern about accepting such generosity. Perhaps you would join me for dinner this evening, Blackwood said quietly to Isabella. We could discuss the sail repair in more detail. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up at this invitation. Isabella hesitated, glancing at Emma, who was still entranced by her new company. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Isabella said carefully. People might misunderstand. Let them misunderstand, Blackwood replied. I'm inviting you to dine, not asking you to sail away with me. Though, he added with a slight smile, I wouldn't object if you chose to do that as well. Isabella blushed at his boldness, but before she could respond, Emma piped up from across the room. Mummy, can we have dinner with Captain Blackwood? I want to tell him about the stories you tell me about the stars. You know about celestial navigation? Blackwood asked Isabella, his interest clearly piqued. Isabella looked trapped between her daughter's enthusiasm and her own reservations. I know something of it, she admitted reluctantly. My late husband was interested in such matters, she added quickly, as if to explain away knowledge that was unusual for a woman of her apparent station. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. Each conversation with Isabella Hartwell revealed new layers to her character. A seamstress who spoke multiple languages, understood navigation, and possessed the bearing of educated nobility despite her current circumstances. The mystery of her past intrigued him almost as much as her beauty. The Anchor and Crown serves excellent fish, Blackwood suggested. It's respectable enough for a lady, and Emma would enjoy their sweet cakes. Emma clapped her hands together. Please, Mummy, I've never eaten sweet cakes in a real tavern. Isabella looked at her daughter's eager face, then at Blackwood's patient expression. Something in his dark eyes suggested this invitation meant more to him than casual interest. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. Very well, but only if you allow me to pay my own way. Absolutely not, Blackwood replied firmly. A gentleman always pays when he invites a lady to dine. As they arranged to meet that evening, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, or the way that figure hurried away as soon as Isabella agreed to the dinner invitation. The Anchor and Crown Tavern buzzed with evening conversation as Captain Blackwood Sterling escorted Isabella and Emma to a corner table away from the rougher crowd. Emma clutched her new compass in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other, her eyes wide with excitement at her first real tavern experience. Isabella had changed from her work dress into her finest gown, a deep green silk that had seen better days but still highlighted her natural elegance. Blackwood found himself watching the way candlelight caught the gold threads woven through the fabric, wondering about the woman who would own such a dress, yet work as a seamstress to survive. Tell me about these star stories Emma mentioned, Blackwood said after they had ordered their meal. Emma bounced in her chair with enthusiasm. Mummy knows all the star patterns. She showed me how sailors use them to find their way across the ocean, and how each star has a name and a story. Isabella looked uncomfortable with the attention. My husband was fascinated by astronomy and navigation. He taught me what he knew before he... She trailed off, her hand instinctively moving to touch the hidden pendant at her throat. Before he passed, Blackwood finished gently. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Isabella murmured. It's been difficult starting over alone with Emma. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food, and Emma's delighted exclamations over the promised sweet cakes. But as they ate, Blackwood noticed Isabella glancing nervously toward the tavern entrance, as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear. "Is something troubling you?" he asked quietly. Isabella hesitated, then leaned closer to speak without Emma overhearing. "I've been receiving strange letters since we arrived in Port Royal. Someone has been asking questions about my late husband's affairs. I fear we may have to leave soon." Blackwood's expression darkened. What kind of questions about property he may have owned? Debts he may have owed? But Thomas left no debts. Captain Sterling. He was a careful man who always paid his obligations. Before Blackwood could respond, a well-dressed man approached their table. He was perhaps 40 years old, with thinning hair and calculating eyes that reminded Blackwood of a merchant appraising valuable cargo. "Mrs. Hartwell," the man said with false warmth. "How delightful to find you here." Isabella's face went pale. "Mr. Marcus, I wasn't expecting to see you in Port Royal." Marcus's gaze flicked to Blackwood with obvious curiosity and barely concealed distaste. "I arrived this afternoon on business. Perhaps we could speak privately about the matters I mentioned in my letters. I believe Mrs. Hartwell is engaged at present," Blackwood said coldly, rising from his chair to his full imposing height. Marcus stepped back instinctively, his hand moving toward his coat, as if reaching for a weapon. "And you are Captain Blackwood Sterling." The name had its usual effect, causing Marcus to pale and several nearby conversations to stop abruptly. "I see," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "Isabella, my dear, I had no idea you were acquainted with such interesting company." "Miss Hartwell and I are discussing business," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Perhaps you could arrange another time to speak with her." Emma, who had been listening with growing confusion, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, who is this man? You look scared." Isabella gathered Emma closer to her side. "This is your father's brother, Marcus, Uncle Marcus." Emma studied Marcus with the blunt honesty of childhood. "You don't look like Papa. Papa was nice." Marcus's forced smile tightened. "Children say such amusing things." "Isabella, we really must discuss your late husband's estate. There are matters that require immediate attention." "What kind of matters?" Blackwood interjected. Marcus's eyes flashed with irritation. "Family business, Captain. Surely you understand the need for privacy in such delicate matters." Isabella stood abruptly, lifting Emma into her arms. "Perhaps we should go," she said to Blackwood. "Emma is getting tired." But as they prepared to leave, Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Isabella, you cannot avoid this indefinitely. Thomas had obligations, agreements that must be honored. If you continue to be uncooperative, I will be forced to take legal action." "What obligations?" Blackwood demanded, his hand moving to rest meaningfully on his sword hilt. Marcus glanced around nervously, suddenly aware that they were attracting attention from other patrons. "Nothing that concerns you, Captain. This is a family matter." "Mummy," Emma whispered, "I want to go home now." Isabella's protective instincts overrode all other considerations. "Yes, sweetheart. Captain Sterling, thank you for a lovely evening, but we should return to our lodgings." As they left the tavern, Marcus followed them outside. "Isabella, you have until tomorrow evening to reconsider. After that, I will pursue other options." Blackwood moved between Marcus and Isabella, his presence a clear warning. "I suggest you choose your next actions carefully, Marcus. Mrs. Hartwell is under my protection now." Marcus's face twisted with anger, and something else, something that looked almost like desperation. "Your protection?" How far that protection extends remains to be seen. He turned and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. As Blackwood escorted Isabella and Emma back to their lodgings, he noticed that Isabella's hands were trembling. Whatever Marcus wanted from her, it was serious enough to follow her to Port Royal and threaten legal action. "Isabella," Blackwood said softly as they reached her door, "if you're in trouble, I want to help." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've already helped more than you know, but this matter with Marcus, it's complicated. Thomas died owing no debts, but Marcus seems to believe otherwise. Then perhaps it's time to examine exactly what Marcus thinks Thomas owed, Blackwood suggested. And to whom? Isabella's hands shook as she unlocked the small trunk beneath her narrow bed. Emma sleeping peacefully on the makeshift pallet nearby. Captain Blackwood Sterling waited patiently in the single chair, his presence somehow making the cramped room feel both safer and more confined. "I shouldn't be showing you this," Isabella whispered, lifting out a leather portfolio secured with ribbon, but Marcus's threats tonight, and his mention of legal action, she trailed off, her resolve wavering. "Whatever you show me remains between us," Blackwood assured her quietly. Isabella untied the ribbon with careful fingers, revealing a collection of documents that made Blackwood lean forward with interest. The papers bore official seals and signatures, written in the precise hand of naval correspondent. Thomas was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hartwell of His Majesty's Navy, Isabella said, her voice barely audible. "He wasn't just interested in astronomy and navigation, Captain Sterling. It was his profession." Blackwood studied the commission papers with growing understanding. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell had been assigned to intelligence work, tracking pirate activities and disrupting their supply lines throughout the Caribbean. The irony wasn't lost on Blackwood that he was now sitting in the dead man's wife's room, offering his protection. "This explains much about your education and bearing," Blackwood said carefully, "but it raises other questions. Why are you hiding your true identity?" Isabella pulled out another document, this one bearing more recent dates. "Because Thomas discovered something during his final mission, something that got him killed." The paper was a detailed report in Thomas Hartwell's handwriting, documenting suspicious activities within the Naval Administration. Names, dates, amounts of gold that had gone missing from official transfer. At the bottom of the page, one name appeared repeatedly: Marcus Hartwell, Naval Procurement Officer. "Your husband's brother was stealing from the Navy," Blackwood said, the pieces falling into place. Isabella nodded miserably. Thomas confronted Marcus privately, hoping to give him a chance to make restitution quietly. Instead, Marcus arranged for Thomas's ship to be ambushed by pirates. He had been secretly supplying with naval intelligence. Blackwood felt a cold fury building in his chest. He had encountered corrupt naval officers before, men who sold information or supplies to pirates for profit. But to arrange the murder of one's own brother crossed a line that even most pirates wouldn't breach. The official report listed Thomas's death as killed in action during a routine patrol. Isabella continued, "Marcus delivered the news personally, along with his condolences and an offer to help me manage Thomas's estate, which gave him access to search for the evidence Thomas had gathered." Blackwood realized. "Thomas was too careful for that," Isabella said with a sad smile. "He had already hidden the most damaging documents, and he told me where to find them if anything happened to him. But Marcus doesn't know what evidence exists, or where it might be hidden." Isabella reached deeper into the portfolio and withdrew a torn piece of parchment covered with symbols and coordinates. Even in the dim candlelight, Blackwood could see it was a fragment of a nautical chart. "Thomas hid the complete evidence somewhere safe," Isabella explained. "This map fragment is the only clue to its location. Marcus has been searching for it ever since Thomas died, growing more desperate as time passes." Blackwood examined the map fragment carefully. The symbols were nautical markers, but some had been altered or added in Thomas's hand. It would take considerable skill to decode the location, and even more courage to retrieve whatever was hidden there. "Why didn't you turn this over to naval authorities?" Blackwood asked. Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Because I don't know how deep Marcus's corruption runs, or who else might be involved. Thomas didn't trust his superiors enough to report through official channels. He was planning to take his evidence directly to the Admiralty in London when he was killed." Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about compass roses and stars. Both adults looked toward the child, reminded of the innocent life caught in the middle of this dangerous game. "Marcus knows I have some of Thomas's papers," Isabella said quietly. "He's been patient because he hoped to convince me to cooperate willingly, but his patience is running out, which is why he followed you to Port Royal," Blackwood concluded. I thought if I disappeared into the Caribbean, started over as a common seamstress, Marcus would eventually give up searching. But he's too desperate to let this go. If the evidence Thomas gathered ever reaches London, Marcus will hang for treason. Blackwood stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the darkened harbour where his ship waited. His crew expected to sail with the morning tide, to return to the profitable business of piracy. Instead, he found himself contemplating a much more dangerous venture. "Isabella," he said finally, "I want you and Emma to come aboard my ship tonight." She looked at him in shock. "Captain, I cannot. The scandal alone would ruin what little reputation I have left." "Your reputation will matter little if Marcus decides to take more direct action," Blackwood replied grimly. "On my ship, you'll be safe while we decide what to do about this evidence." Isabella clutched the map fragment tighter. "And what do you propose we do?" Blackwood turned from the window, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like a predator's. "We're going to find whatever Thomas hid, and then we're going to make Marcus Hartwell pay for his crime." The crimson tide rocked gently at anchor as Isabella stepped aboard with Emma in her arms, her few possessions bundled in a canvas sack. The pirate crew watched with curiosity and barely concealed skepticism as their captain escorted a lady and child to his private cabin. Emma, however, was enchanted by everything she saw, from massive masts stretching toward the stars to the intricate ropework that seemed to create patterns in the moonlight. "Is this really a pirate ship?" Emma whispered in wonder, clutching her compass as Blackwood showed them to his quarters. "It is indeed," Blackwood replied, opening the door to reveal a surprisingly well-appointed cabin. Books lined built-in shelves, charts covered a large table, and a comfortable bed dominated one corner. "But we prefer to think of ourselves as independent merchants." Isabella looked around the cabin with surprise. She had expected crude accommodations reflecting the rough reputation of pirates, but Blackwood's quarters spoke of education and refinement. Navigation instruments gleamed on his desk, and the books included volumes on astronomy, philosophy, and literature in several languages. "You can read Latin," Isabella observed, noting a well-worn copy of Virgil among the volumes. "Oxford education," Blackwood said with a slight smile. "Much good it did me." Before Isabella could ask what had driven an Oxford-educated man to piracy, Connor Walsh knocked on the cabin door. Blackwood's first mate entered with obvious reluctance, his weathered face showing disapproval of the entire situation. "Captain, the crew is asking questions," Walsh said bluntly. "They want to know why we're harboring passengers instead of sailing for the treasure fleet routes." "The crew will be informed when they need to be informed," Blackwood replied coldly. "Until then, they follow orders." Walsh glanced at Isabella and Emma, then back at his captain. "With respect, sir, the men signed on for piracy, not charity work. Some are starting to wonder if you've gone soft." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees as Blackwood's expression hardened. "Would you like to be the one to test that theory, Connor?" Walsh stepped back instinctively. He had served under Blackwood long enough to recognize the dangerous edge in his captain's voice. "No, sir, but Jenkins and some of the others are talking. They say harboring a naval officer's widow could bring the entire British fleet down on us." Emma looked up from the compass she'd been studying. "My papa wasn't mean like other Navy men," she said seriously. "He told me stories and helped people who were lost." The innocence in her voice seemed to affect Walsh more than Blackwood's threats. The grizzled first mate's expression softened slightly as he looked at the child. "I'm sure he was a good man, little miss," Walsh said quietly. Isabella stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to address the crew's concerns directly. "Mr. Walsh, I understand your men's lotus to become involved in our troubles, but I want you to know that my late husband was not your typical naval officer." She moved to Blackwood's chart table and spread out one of Thomas's documents. Thomas documented corruption within his own service. He discovered that naval officers were selling information to pirates, arranging for gold shipments to be intercepted. Walsh studied the document with growing interest. Like most experienced sailors, he could read charts and recognize official naval correspondence. This says Marcus Hartwell was providing ship schedules and cargo manifests to pirate captains. The same Marcus who threatened Isabella tonight, Blackwood added. The man who arranged his own brother's murder to cover his crimes. Walsh looked between the document and Isabella with new understanding. So helping you isn't just charity work. It's taking down a corrupt bastard who's been feeding information to our competition. Exactly, Isabella said, relieved that the first mate was beginning to see their situation in terms the crew could accept. The evidence Thomas gathered could expose an entire network of corruption that has been making piracy more dangerous for everyone. Emma, who had been listening with the focused attention children brought to adult conversations they didn't fully understand, spoke up suddenly. Walsh, are you going to help us find the treasure Papa hid? Walsh looked startled. Treasure? Isabella quickly explained about the map fragment and the hidden cache of evidence, carefully avoiding mention of its exact nature. To the crew, this could be presented as a treasure hunt with the added benefit of striking back at corrupt naval officials. The evidence is hidden somewhere in the Caribbean, Isabella continued. Thomas left clues that only someone with his navigation skills could follow. Blackwood watched Walsh's expression change as the first mate began to see the possibilities. A treasure hunt was something the crew could understand and support, especially if it involved outwitting the Navy. How much treasure are we talking about? Walsh asked carefully. Isabella glanced at Blackwood, silently asking for guidance. How much should she reveal about the true nature of what they were seeking? Enough to make this venture profitable for everyone involved, Blackwood answered diplomatically, plus the satisfaction of bringing Marcus Hartwell to justice. A coded letter crinkled in Isabella's pocket as she shifted position, reminding her of the message that had been slipped under her door at the boarding house just before they fled to the ship. Marcus's final warning, demanding that she meet with him tomorrow evening or face the consequences. Captain, Isabella said quietly, there's something else you should know about Marcus's desperation. Isabella's hands trembled as she unfolded the coded letter that had been slipped under her door, the parchment crackling in the quiet cabin. Emma had finally fallen asleep in Blackwood's bed, exhausted by the day's excitement, while Connor Walsh waited with growing curiosity. This arrived just before we left the boarding house, Isabella said, smoothing the letter on Blackwood's chart table. It's written in a cipher Thomas taught me, in case we ever needed to communicate secretly during his missions. Blackwood leaned closer, studying the seemingly random letters and numbers scattered across the page. Can you decode it? Isabella nodded, pulling out a piece of paper to work on the translation. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, substituting letters according to a pattern only she and her late husband had known. Slowly, Marcus's message became clear. My dear sister-in-law, Isabella read aloud, her voice growing colder with each word. Your continued defiance has forced my hand. I have engaged Captain Rodrigo Vasquez and his crew to assist in recovering my late brother's property. Captain Vasquez has a reputation for being most persuasive in business negotiations. Walsh sucked in a sharp breath. Rodrigo Vasquez, that Spanish bastard who burns ships for entertainment. You know him? Blackwood asked grimly. By reputation. He's not a pirate, he's a monster. Uses torture and terror to get what he wants. If Marcus has hired him, Isabella continued reading, her voice barely steady. You have until tomorrow, at sunset, to deliver Thomas's papers and any other materials in your possession. Meet me at the old Spanish fort on Tortuga. Come alone, or Captain Vasquez has my permission to be creative in his methods of persuasion. The cabin fell silent, except for the gentle creaking of the ship and Emma's peaceful breathing. Walsh was the first to speak, his voice filled with professional concern. Captain Vasquez commands a 40-gun frigate with a crew of cutthroats who'd sell their own mothers for rum money. This isn't some corrupt naval officer we can handle with clever planning, but Blackwood wasn't listening to Walsh's warnings. Instead, he was studying Isabella's face as she stared at the decoded message, watching her process the full implications of Marcus's threat. There's more, Isabella said quietly, turning the letter over to reveal additional text. Marcus has been monitoring my activities since I arrived in Port Royal. He knows about Emma, about where we've been staying. He knows about you, Captain Sterling." She looked up at Blackwood with eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "He's threatening to have Vasquez target anyone who has shown me kindness, starting with the people at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop." Walsh cursed under his breath. "He's just after the evidence anymore. He's trying to force your hand by threatening innocent people." Isabella stood abruptly and moved to where Emma slept, gently stroking her daughter's hair. "I have to go to Tortuga," she said quietly. "I can't let Marcus hurt innocent people because of my choices." "Absolutely not," Blackwood said firmly. "You'd be sailing directly into a trap." "What choice do I have?" Isabella turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd met her, Blackwood saw the full depth of her desperation. "Marcus has spent months tracking me down. He's hired a monster like Vasquez. He'll keep escalating until he gets what he wants." Isabella moved to her small bundle of possessions and withdrew another document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. "This is Thomas's true will and testament," she said, handing it to Blackwood. "The one Marcus doesn't know exists." Blackwood unfolded the document carefully, his eyes widening as he read. "Thomas left everything to you and Emma, including property Marcus has been claiming as his own inheritance." "More than that," Isabella said. "Thomas documented Marcus's embezzlement in his will, along with instructions for his evidence to be delivered to specific officials in London, who Thomas trusted. But most importantly, he revealed that Marcus has been operating under false authority for years." Walsh leaned over Blackwood's shoulder to read the document. "What do you mean, false authority?" Isabella's voice filled with bitter satisfaction. "Marcus Hartwell was discharged from the Navy 3 years ago for theft and insubordination. Everything he's done since then, every contract he's signed, every order he's given, has been while impersonating a naval officer. The implications hit both men simultaneously. Marcus wasn't just guilty of corruption and murder, he was guilty of treason on a scale that would see him hanged in chains as an example to others. Which explains his desperation," Blackwood realized. "If this will ever reaches the authorities, Marcus faces execution, not just imprisonment." Isabella nodded. "Thomas discovered Marcus's deception during his investigation. That's when Marcus decided his brother had to die." "But why hide this information?" Walsh asked. "Why not expose Marcus immediately?" Isabella looked toward her sleeping daughter. "Because exposing Marcus means revealing my true identity, which puts Emma in danger. As long as we remain anonymous, we're just another widow and child trying to survive. But as the family of Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hartwell, we become valuable targets for anyone with grudges against the Navy." Blackwood carefully refolded the will, his mind racing through the possibilities this revelation created. Marcus wasn't just a corrupt official anymore. He was a desperate man with nothing left to lose, which made him infinitely more dangerous. "Isabella," Blackwood said quietly, "I think it's time you learned exactly what kind of pirate you've chosen to trust with your secrets." Blackwood moved to his desk and withdrew a key from beneath a hidden panel, using it to unlock a chest that Isabella hadn't noticed before. From within, he pulled out a sword unlike any she had ever seen. The blade gleamed like silver fire in the candlelight, its hilt wrapped in worn leather that spoke of countless battles. But it was the inscription along the blade that made Isabella gasp. "Honor above all," she read aloud. "That's the motto of the Royal Navy." "This sword belonged to my father," Blackwood said quietly, running his fingers along the familiar engravings. "Admiral Sir Marcus Sterling, Knight of the Realm, defender of the Crown's interests in the Caribbean." Walsh shifted uncomfortably in the corner. He had served under Blackwood for 8 years, but had never heard the complete story of his captain's past. "Your father was Admiral Sterling," Isabella's voice filled with recognition. "Thomas spoke of him with great respect. He said Admiral Sterling was one of the few high-ranking officers who couldn't be bought or intimidated." Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "Yes, he was incorruptible, completely dedicated to duty and honor, no matter the cost to those around him." Isabella sensed the pain beneath Blackwood's words, but didn't interrupt as he continued. "I followed in his footsteps initially, Oxford education, naval commission, rapid promotion through family connections. I was Captain James Stirling of His Majesty's Navy, destined for great things. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about sea monsters and brave sailors. Blackwood glanced toward her with unexpected tenderness before returning to his story. 3 years ago, I discovered that several of my fellow officers were selling naval intelligence to pirates. Not unlike your Marcus, they were arranging for merchant ships to be attacked, splitting the profits with their criminal partners. Isabella leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. I reported my findings to my superiors, expecting swift justice. Instead, I learned that the corruption went far higher than I had imagined. My own commanding officer was involved, along with officials in London who were supposed to be investigating such crimes. Walsh spoke up from the corner. That's when you resigned your commission. Resign? Blackwood laughed bitterly. I was court-martialed for making false accusations against superior officers. The evidence I had gathered mysteriously disappeared, and I was labeled a traitor who was attempting to undermine naval discipline. Isabella felt her heart ache for the young man Blackwood had once been, idealistic and trusting in the system he served. My father attended the court-martial, Blackwood continued, his voice growing harder. He sat in the gallery and watched his son be branded a disgrace to the family name. When I was stripped of my commission and sentenced to imprisonment, he never said a word in my defense. How did you escape? Isabella asked softly. Connor helped me, Blackwood said, nodding toward his first mate. He was a petty officer on my ship, one of the few men who knew I was telling the truth. He organized my escape before I could be transported to prison. Walsh straightened slightly at this acknowledgement. Couldn't let them lock up the only honest captain I'd ever served under. So, we became pirates, Blackwood said with dark humor. If the Navy wanted to treat me as a criminal, I decided to become the best criminal I could be. Isabella studied Blackwood's face, seeing past the hardened pirate captain to the disappointed idealist beneath. But you've never attacked naval vessels or merchant ships protected by the crown. How did you know that? Isabella smiled slightly, because Thomas kept detailed records of pirate activities in the Caribbean. Your name appears frequently, but always in connection with attacking Spanish treasure ships or vessels flying under corrupt colonial governments. Never British merchants or naval vessels. Blackwood looked surprised that his restraint had been noticed and documented. You're still fighting the same battle, Isabella realized, just from the other side of the law. Perhaps, Blackwood admitted, but that doesn't change what I've become, or the danger that association with me could bring to you and Emma. Isabella reached across the space between them and gently touched the hand that held his father's sword. Captain Stirling, when Emma asked you for help finding her mother, you could have walked away. When Marcus threatened us, you could have decided we were too much trouble. When you learned about Thomas's evidence, you could have taken it and left us behind. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Instead, you've shown more honor than most of the supposedly honorable men I've known. Thomas would have been proud to call you a friend. Emma chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily in the candlelight. Captain Blackwood, are you and Mommy going to fight the bad men together? Blackwood looked at the trust in Emma's innocent eyes, then at Isabella's determined expression. Yes, Em, we're going to fight the bad men together. Outside the cabin, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. Soon they would need to make final preparations for what might be the most dangerous mission of Blackwood's pirating career. The old Spanish fort on Tortuga rose from the rocky coastline like a weathered stone giant, its crumbling walls bearing witness to decades of Caribbean warfare. As the crimson tide approached the island in the afternoon light, Isabella stood at the bow with Blackwood, studying the fortress through his spyglass. Vasquez's ship is already anchored in the bay, she observed, pointing toward the sleek frigate flying Spanish colors. Even from a distance, the vessel looked predatory, built for speed and violence rather than cargo. And Marcus? Blackwood asked, adjusting the spyglass to scan the shore. There, Isabella pointed toward a smaller sloop beached near the fort's base. That's the ship he hired to bring him from Jamaica. Emma sat nearby with Connor Walsh, who was teaching her to tie sailors' knots with infinite patience. The child had adapted to life aboard a pirate ship with remarkable ease, charming the crew with her curiosity and fearless question. "Captain," Walsh said quietly, "I've got men positioned in the rigging with muskets, and Jenkins has the cannons loaded with grape shot. But Vasquez has superior firepower if this turns into a fight." Blackwood lowered the spyglass and turned to Isabella. "Are you certain about this plan?" Isabella touched the wooden chest they had prepared, its contents carefully arranged to give the appearance of containing Thomas's complete archive. "Marcus wants Thomas's evidence, and he wants to believe he's won. We give him both at least long enough to get close." The plan was risky but simple. Isabella would meet Marcus at the fort as demanded, carrying what appeared to be all of Thomas's documents. But the real evidence, including the will that exposed Marcus's deception, remained safely hidden aboard the Crimson Tide. More importantly, Isabella would not be going to the meeting alone. "Remember," Blackwood said, checking the priming on his pistols, "you signal us the moment you have confirmation of his crimes in front of witnesses." Isabella nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. So much could go wrong with their improvised plan. Marcus was desperate, Vasquez was unpredictable, and the presence of Emma on the ship made retreat impossible if things went badly. As they prepared to lower a boat for the journey to shore, Emma tugged at Blackwood's coat. "Captain, are you going to hurt the bad man?" Blackwood knelt to meet Emma's eyes, his expression serious but gentle. "Emma, sometimes good people have to fight bad people to protect the ones they love. But we're going to try very hard to solve this without anyone getting hurt, like Papa used to do. Exactly like your Papa used to do." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation and returned to her knot-tying practice with Walsh. But Isabella caught the worried look that passed between the two men. They all understood that Marcus's desperation made a peaceful resolution unlikely. The boat ride to shore passed in tense silence, broken only by the splash of oars and the distant cry of seabirds. Isabella clutched the chest containing the false documents, while Blackwood checked his weapons one final time. Behind them, the Crimson Tide maintained position just outside the bay, ready to provide support or cover their escape. The Spanish fort loomed larger as they approached, its ancient stones scarred by cannon fire and weathered by tropical storms. A figure waited at the main entrance, and Isabella's heart sank as she recognized Marcus's confident stance. "He looks pleased with himself," Blackwood observed grimly. "He thinks he's about to solve all his problems," Isabella replied. "Let's hope that confidence makes him careless." They beached the boat on a small stretch of sand below the fort, and Isabella took a deep breath to steady her nerves. Everything depended on the next hour. Either they would gather enough evidence to expose Marcus's crimes to the authorities, or they would be fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. "Isabella," Blackwood said softly, catching her hand before she could step onto the beach. "Whatever happens in there, know that meeting you and Emma has changed everything for me." Isabella felt her heart skip at the intensity in his dark eyes. "James Sterling, are you trying to tell me something important right before we walk into mortal danger?" "I'm telling you that I love you," he said simply, "and that I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your trust." Before Isabella could respond, a voice called out from the fort above them. "Isabella, how touching to see you've brought a friend to our family reunion." Marcus Hartwell stood silhouetted against the sky, no longer bothering to hide the cruel satisfaction in his voice. Beside him, a dark-skinned man in Spanish naval uniform watched the beach with predatory interest. "Captain Vasquez, I presume," Blackwood muttered. Isabella squared her shoulders and picked up the chest. "It's time to end this." As they climbed the rocky path toward the fort's entrance, neither of them noticed the third figure watching from the shadows of the ruined battlements, or the way that figure raised a spyglass to signal ships hidden beyond the horizon. The interior of the Spanish fort reeked of decay and abandonment, its stone corridors echoing with their footsteps, as Marcus led them deeper into the structure. Captain Vasquez followed silently, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, while several of his crew members took positions that blocked the obvious escape routes. "I must admit, Isabella, I'm impressed by your resourcefulness," Marcus said as they entered what had once been the fort's main courtyard. Broken stones and twisted metal littered the ground, remnants of battles fought decades ago. Disappearing into the Caribbean, assuming a false identity, even finding yourself a pirate protector. Thomas always said you were cleverer than you appear. Isabella set the chest down carefully in the center of the courtyard, her eyes scanning for the witnesses Blackwood had promised would be in position. You mean the brother who trusted you enough to confide his suspicions about naval corruption? The brother you had murdered to protect your crimes? Marcus's pleasant demeanor cracked slightly. Thomas was naive, always believing the best of people. He couldn't understand that sometimes moral compromises are necessary for the greater good. Greater good? Isabella's voice rose with genuine anger. You stole from the crown, sold naval secrets to enemies, and arranged your own brother's death. What greater good could possibly justify that? Vasquez stepped forward with fluid grace, his dark eyes fixed on Blackwood with professional interest. Captain Sterling, your reputation precedes you. I am curious why such a successful pirate would risk everything for a woman and child. Perhaps because some things are worth more than gold, Blackwood replied evenly, though his hand moved imperceptibly closer to his weapon. How romantic! Vasquez smiled, revealing teeth capped with silver. I wonder if you will maintain such noble sentiments when I begin removing your lady's fingers one by one. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Isabella felt her resolve waver for a moment, remembering Emma sleeping safely aboard the Crimson Tide. But then she thought of Thomas's sacrifice, of all the innocent people Marcus had harmed, and her determination hardened into steel. Before you resort to torture, Marcus, Isabella said loudly, perhaps you'd like to examine what I've brought you. She opened the chest with theatrical flourish, revealing documents that appeared to be Thomas's complete intelligence file. Marcus moved closer eagerly, his eyes lighting up as he recognized his brother's handwriting and official naval seals. Excellent, Marcus breathed, reaching for the papers. I knew you would eventually see reason. But as Marcus lifted the first document to examine it closely, Isabella stepped back and raised her voice to carry beyond the courtyard walls. Tell me, Marcus, exactly what crimes are documented in those papers. Marcus looked up sharply, suddenly suspicious of her cooperative tone. What game are you playing, Isabella? No game. I simply want to hear you admit what Thomas discovered, what you killed him to hide. Vasquez's eyes narrowed as he sensed a trap developing. Senora, perhaps we should complete our business more quickly. But Marcus, consumed by his need to know exactly what evidence existed against him, continued examining the documents. Thomas documented my business arrangements with certain Caribbean merchants, he said absently. Arrangements that were perfectly legal, if unconventional. Merchants like Captain Vasquez. Isabella pressed. Men who attacked British ships using intelligence you provided. Strategic information sharing, Marcus corrected. The Caribbean is a complex political environment requiring flexible approaches. Blackwood watched the proceedings with growing admiration for Isabella's courage. She was deliberately provoking Marcus into incriminating himself, counting on his arrogance to overcome his caution. And the missing gold from naval accounts. Isabella continued relentless. The funds that were supposed to support British operations but somehow found their way into private hands. Marcus's head snapped up, his face flushing with anger. Thomas had no right to investigate matters beyond his authority. I was protecting sensitive operations from bureaucratic interference. Operations like arranging your brother's murder? Thomas forced that choice. Marcus exploded, his careful composure finally cracking completely. He was going to destroy years of careful work, ruin arrangements that benefited everyone involved. One man's life against the stability of an entire network. The admission echoed off the stone walls with damning clarity. Isabella felt a surge of triumph, knowing that hidden observers would carry Marcus's confession to the authorities. But her victory was short-lived as Vasquez suddenly drew his sword. Enough theater, the Spanish captain snarled. You have led us into a trap, Senora, but we are not helpless rabbits to be snared so easily. Marcus looked around wildly as the implications of his outburst penetrated his rage. Isabella, what have you done? What Thomas would have done. Isabella replied steadily. Ensured that justice is served. Blackwood's sword cleared its scabbard in one fluid motion as Vasquez's men moved to surround them. The final confrontation was about to begin. Steel rang against steel as Blackwood's blade met Vasquez in a shower of sparks. The Spanish captain was skilled, his movements fluid and precise, but Blackwood fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything he held dear. Isabella pressed herself against the courtyard wall as Marcus lunged for the scattered documents, his face twisted with panic and rage. She had anticipated his reaction and allowed him to grab the papers, knowing they contained carefully crafted forgeries that would only further incriminate him. "You think you're so clever," Marcus panted, clutching the false documents to his chest. "But Vasquez brought 20 men. Your pirate lover cannot fight them all." As if summoned by his words, more of Vasquez's crew poured into the courtyard, through various entrances, their weapons drawn and bloodthirsty grins on their scarred faces. Isabella's heart sank as she realized they were hopelessly outnumbered. But then the sound of musket fire echoed from the fort's upper levels, followed by shouts of alarm and confusion. Through gaps in the ruined walls, Isabella could see muzzle flashes and smoke as hidden figures engaged Vasquez's men. "What trickery is this?" Vasquez snarled, pressing his attack against Blackwood, while glancing nervously at the battle raging around them. "No trickery," Blackwood replied between sword strokes, "just friends arriving at the right moment." Connor Walsh appeared at the courtyard entrance with a dozen of Blackwood's crew, their faces grim with battle fever. Behind them came an unexpected sight that made Isabella's heart leap with hope. British naval officers in full dress uniform, led by a grey-haired man whose bearing spoke of decades of command authority. "Stand down, all of you," the naval officer commanded in a voice that had been obeyed across oceans. "This is Commodore Harrison of His Majesty's Caribbean Fleet, and I am placing everyone present under naval jurisdiction." "Commodore Harrison," Isabella called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard despite the chaos. "I am Isabella Hartwell, widow of Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hartwell. I have evidence of treason and murder that requires your immediate attention." Vasquez realized that his position had become untenable. With a snarl of frustrated rage, he disengaged from his duel with Blackwood and shouted orders in rapid Spanish. His remaining crew began a fighting retreat toward the fort's rear exits, covering their captain's escape. "Let them go," Commodore Harrison ordered, as several of his Marines moved to pursue. "Vasquez will face justice another day. Today we have more pressing concerns." Marcus made a desperate attempt to follow Vasquez's retreat, but Connor Walsh blocked his path with casual efficiency. The corrupt former naval officer found himself surrounded by men who had no sympathy for traitors. "Marcus Hartwell," Commodore Harrison said formally, approaching the cowering man, "you are under arrest for treason, murder, and impersonation of a naval officer. The evidence against you has been most thoroughly documented." Isabella felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized their plan had succeeded. The naval witnesses had heard Marcus's confession, and his crimes would finally be exposed to proper authorities. But her relief was short-lived as Blackwood swayed on his feet, blood seeping through his shirt from a wound Vasquez's blade had inflicted during their duel. Isabella rushed to his side, catching him as his knees buckled. "It's not serious," Blackwood insisted, though his face had gone pale. "Just a scratch." "Don't be ridiculous," Isabella said firmly, examining the wound with the practical efficiency of a woman who had tended many injuries. "You need proper medical attention." Commodore Harrison approached them with an expression that mixed official authority with personal curiosity. "Captain Sterling, I presume? Your reputation precedes you, though I confess the reports did not mention your involvement with naval intelligence matters." Blackwood straightened, despite his injury, meeting the Commodore's gaze with dignity. "I am no longer Captain Sterling of the Royal Navy, Commodore. That man died 3 years ago in a court-martial chamber." "Perhaps," Harrison replied thoughtfully, "but the man who helped expose this conspiracy and protected Lieutenant Commander Hartwell's widow shows remarkable resemblance to the officer I once knew by reputation." Isabella looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents of meaning she didn't fully understand. "Commodore Harrison, how did you know to come here today?" Harrison smiled slightly. "Your husband was more thorough than even you realized, Mrs. Hartwell. Before his death, he sent coded messages to several trusted officers, including myself. We have been investigating Marcus Hartwell's activities for months, waiting for the right moment to act. The revelation that Thomas had set larger wheels in motion even before his death filled Isabella with renewed admiration for her late husband's courage and foresight. And now?" Blackwood asked, wincing as Isabella tightened a makeshift bandage around his wound. "Now we return to Jamaica for proper legal proceedings," Harrison replied. "All of it." The governor's mansion in Port Royal bustled with unusual activity as officials from London examined the mountain of evidence that had emerged from Thomas Hartwell's investigation. Isabella sat in an elegant drawing room, Emma on her lap, watching through tall windows as ships arrived and departed with messages for the Admiralty. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at Tortuga, 3 weeks during which Isabella's world had transformed beyond recognition. Marcus sat in the island's prison, awaiting transport to London for trial, while investigators unraveled the full extent of his criminal network. The scope of corruption he had facilitated stretched far beyond what even Thomas had suspected. "Mrs. Hartwell," a young clerk appeared in the doorway, holding an official document bearing impressive seals. "Commodore Harrison requests your presence in his office. There are matters requiring your signature." Isabella followed the clerk through marble corridors lined with portraits of colonial governors, Emma skipping beside her with the compass Blackwood had given her. The child had adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable resilience, treating their temporary residence in the governor's mansion as an exciting adventure. Commodore Harrison's temporary office overlooked the harbor, where the Crimson Tide remained anchored under the watchful eyes of naval guards. Isabella's heart clenched every time she saw Blackwood's ship, knowing that its captain remained confined to quarters while officials debated his fate. "Mrs. Hartwell, please be seated," Harrison said warmly, gesturing toward a comfortable chair. "I have news that I believe will please you greatly." Isabella settled Emma with a picture book before taking her seat, noting the satisfied expression on the Commodore's weathered face. "The Admiralty has reviewed all evidence in your late husband's case," Harrison began, unfolding a document heavy with official ribbons. "Thomas Hartwell's name has been posthumously cleared of all suspicion, and he is to be honored for his service to the Crown. More significantly, his investigation has led to the exposure of corruption involving dozens of officials across the Caribbean." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at this vindication of Thomas's sacrifice. "And Marcus will hang for treason, as will several of his co-conspirators. The network he helped create has been thoroughly dismantled." Harrison's expression grew more serious. "There is also the matter of restitution. The Crown has recovered substantial funds from Marcus's accounts, money that rightfully belongs to Thomas's estate." The document Harrison handed her contained figures that made Isabella's eyes widen. Thomas's investigation had not only exposed corruption, but had also led to the recovery of nearly £250,000 in stolen naval funds. "This is far more than I ever expected," Isabella said softly. "Your husband died protecting the interests of the Crown, Mrs. Hartwell. The Crown takes care of its own." Harrison paused, studying her face carefully. "There is also the matter of your future. The Admiralty is prepared to offer you a generous pension and a cottage in England, where you and Emma could live in comfort and safety." Isabella looked out the window toward Blackwood's ship, her heart torn between security and love. "That is very generous, Commodore," Harrison prompted, clearly sensing her hesitation. Before Isabella could answer, Emma looked up from her picture book. "Commodore Harrison, when is Captain Blackwood coming to visit us?" "I miss him." Harrison's expression softened as he looked at the child. "That is complicated, young lady. Captain Sterling's legal situation requires careful consideration." Isabella leaned forward in her chair. "What kind of consideration?" Harrison stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the classic pose of naval officers. "James Sterling was court-martialed based on false charges we now know were engineered by the same corrupt officials your husband exposed. The evidence suggests that Captain Sterling was telling the truth about the corruption he discovered, which means his conviction was unjust, Isabella realized. Precisely, the Admiralty is prepared to offer Captain Sterling a full pardon and restoration to his former rank, with back pay and honors appropriate to his service. Isabella's heart leaped at this news, but Harrison's continued serious expression suggested there were complications. However, the Commodore continued, such reinstatement would require Captain Sterling to abandon his current profession and return to legitimate naval service. Given his success as a privateer, some officials question whether he would accept such constraints. Isabella understood the dilemma. Blackwood had built a new life outside the system that had betrayed him, creating his own code of honor and his own form of justice. Returning to naval service would mean abandoning that hard-won independence. Has anyone asked Captain Sterling what he wants? Isabella inquired. Harrison smiled. As a matter of fact, he is waiting in the outer office. I thought you might wish to discuss these matters together before any final decisions are made. Emma jumped up from her chair with excitement. Can we see him now, please? As Harrison moved toward the door to summon Blackwood, Isabella felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety. The choices they made in the next hour would determine not only their future together, but also the kind of life they could offer Emma. Blackwood entered the Commodore's office with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to navigate both drawing rooms and pirate dens with equal skill. 3 weeks of confinement had not diminished his presence, though Isabella noted new lines around his eyes that spoke of difficult contemplation. Emma ran to him immediately, wrapping her small arms around his legs with uninhibited joy. Captain Blackwood, I've learned to read sea charts, and I can tie 7 different knots now. Blackwood lifted Emma into his arms, his face softening with genuine affection. 7 knots? You'll be ready to captain your own ship soon. That's what Mr. Walsh said too. He's been teaching me about tides and wind patterns. Isabella watched this interaction with a full heart, seeing how naturally Blackwood had accepted his role in Emma's life. Whatever decisions lay ahead, she knew that Emma had found in him the father figure she needed. James, Isabella said quietly, rising to greet him properly. You look well, as do you. Blackwood's eyes held hers with an intensity that made Commodore Harrison clear his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should discuss the official matters first, Harrison suggested, then allow you time for private conversation. Blackwood set Emma down gently and turned to face the Commodore with military bearing that reminded Isabella of the naval officer he had once been. Commodore Harrison has explained the Admiralty's offer, Isabella said. Full reinstatement, cleared record, restoration of rank and privileges. And you, Isabella, what does the Admiralty offer you? Harrison answered before Isabella could speak. Security, comfort, a respectable life in England, with a generous pension. Everything a widow and her child could need for a proper future. Blackwood nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. All very reasonable and generous. But, Harrison prompted, clearly sensing reservation. Blackwood moved to the window overlooking the harbor, his gaze fixed on the crimson tide. 3 years ago, the Royal Navy branded me a traitor and destroyed my faith in institutional justice. I've spent those years learning that sometimes honor exists outside official channels, that sometimes good men must work outside the law to accomplish what the law cannot. Isabella joined him at the window, drawn by the conflict in his voice. Are you saying you prefer piracy to naval service? I'm saying that the man who accepted the Admiralty's offer 3 years ago no longer exists. The question is whether the man I've become can find a place within the system that once rejected him. Emma tugged at Blackwood's coat, demanding attention with the persistence of childhood. Captain Blackwood, does this mean you can't marry Mommy and be my new papa? The innocent question created a moment of profound silence in the elegant office. Harrison studied his hands with diplomatic discretion, while Isabella felt heat rise in her cheek. Emma, Isabella began, but Blackwood knelt to address the child directly. Emma, do you remember what I told you about fighting bad men to protect the people you love? Emma nodded solemnly. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices about the best way to protect their families. Your mommy and I need to talk about those choices. Harrison stood, recognizing his cue to provide privacy. Perhaps I could show young Emma the naval charts in my map room while you discuss these matters.
After Emma departed with the Commodore, Isabella and Blackwood found themselves alone for the first time in weeks. The weight of unspoken feelings and unmade decisions filled the space between them. Isabella, Blackwood said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will respect your choice. If you believe Emma would be better served by a respectable life in England, I will not interfere." Isabella moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty he was trying to hide. "And what do you believe would be best for Emma? And for me? I believe," Blackwood said slowly, "that Emma needs a father who will teach her to be brave and strong and true to her principles. Whether that father wears a naval uniform or captain's coat matters less than the character beneath." "And what about what I need?" Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability beneath his careful control. "You need someone who will love you without reservation, who will protect you and Emma with his life, who will build a future worthy of your trust. The question is whether that someone can be a former pirate with a complicated past." Isabella reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of sun and salt-weathered skin. "James Sterling, 3 weeks ago you risked everything to help me expose Marcus's crimes. You fought trained killers to protect a woman and child you barely knew. You gave up your ship's freedom to ensure justice was served." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If that's not the character of a man worthy of trust, then I don't understand what honor means." Before Blackwood could respond, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring weeks of separation and uncertainty into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "So what do we tell the Commodore?" Blackwood asked. Isabella smiled with the confidence of a woman who had finally found her path forward. "We tell him that Captain and Mrs. Sterling accept the Admiralty's offer, with certain conditions of our own." 6 months later, Captain James Sterling of the Royal Navy stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Intrepid, watching the sun rise over the Caribbean waters that had become his second home. The frigate cut through the gentle swells with practiced ease, her crew working with the efficiency that came from months of rigorous training and successful missions. "Signal from the port watch, Captain," reported Lieutenant Morrison, a young officer who had quickly learned to respect his commander's unconventional background. Spanish merchantman bearing northeast, flying colors of distress. James raised his spyglass to study the distant vessel, noting the jury-rigged masts and listing deck that spoke of recent storm damage. "What's your assessment, Lieutenant?" "Genuine distress, sir. No signs of deception or hostile intent." James nodded approvingly. Morrison had developed good instincts during their patrols, learning to distinguish between legitimate maritime emergencies and the elaborate traps that pirates sometimes employed. "Signal our intent to render assistance, and send word to Mrs. Sterling that we may have passengers for dinner." Below decks, Isabella looked up from the navigation charts she had been updating, her pen poised over calculations that would have impressed the Admiralty's finest cartographers. Emma sat nearby at a small desk. James had commissioned specifically for her use, practicing her letters with the determination of a child who understood the importance of education. "Another rescue?" Isabella asked, as the young midshipman delivered James's message. "Appears so, ma'am. Spanish merchant vessel in distress." Isabella smiled and rose to make preparations. In 6 months of patrolling the Caribbean, HMS Intrepid had become legendary, not just for its effectiveness against piracy, but for its humanitarian mission. James had negotiated unusual latitude from the Admiralty, allowing him to pursue his own interpretation of naval duty that included protecting merchant vessels regardless of their national origin. The arrangement had proved remarkably successful. Pirates who had once feared Blackwood Sterling now learned to fear Captain Sterling even more, while honest merchants of all nations had come to see the Intrepid as a guardian angel of the Caribbean shipping lanes. "Mummy," Emma said, looking up from her writing, "will the Spanish people have children? I haven't talked to any children in Spanish for weeks."
Isabella marveled at her daughter's linguistic development. Life aboard a naval vessel had exposed Emma to sailors from across the empire, and she was rapidly becoming fluent in several languages. More importantly, she was developing the confidence and curiosity that would serve her well whatever future she chose. "We'll see, sweetheart. Finish your letters first." On deck, James watched his crew prepare for the rescue operation with professional satisfaction. Connor Walsh, now serving as his first mate with official naval rank, directed the preparations with the same quiet efficiency he had shown aboard the Crimson Tide. Several other members of James's former pirate crew had accepted pardons and naval commissions, bringing valuable experience to their legitimate service. The transition had not been without challenges. Some traditional naval officers remained suspicious of James's unconventional background and methods, but results spoke louder than prejudice, and HMS Intrepid had already captured or sunk more pirate vessels than any other ship in the Caribbean fleet. Captain Walsh reported, "We're ready to take the Spanish vessel under tow." Her captain requests permission to come aboard and express his gratitude personally. James nodded his approval, then went below to find Isabella and Emma. He found them in their cabin, Isabella changing into one of the elegant gowns that had been tailored for her new role as a naval captain's wife, while Emma practiced curtsying with serious concentration. "How do I look, Papa James?" Emma asked, using the name she had chosen for him after their wedding 3 months ago. James knelt to her level, adjusting the small pendant she wore. A child-sized compass rose that matched the one Isabella wore on her chain, like a proper young lady who could charm admirals and pirates alike. Emma giggled with delight, then grew serious. "Papa James, when I'm older, can I serve on a Navy ship too?" James exchanged a meaningful look with Isabella over Emma's head. They had discussed this question many times, wondering how to balance Emma's obvious aptitude for maritime life with social expectations about proper roles for young ladies. "Emma," Isabella said carefully, "there are many ways to serve your country and help people. Some require wearing a uniform, others require different kinds of courage." "Like what Mommy does with the charts and navigation?" Emma asked perceptively. "Exactly like that," James confirmed. "Your mother's work helps if ships safe and sailors alive, even though she doesn't carry a sword or command a crew." As they prepared to welcome their Spanish guests, James reflected on how completely his life had transformed. The angry young man who had been cashiered from the Navy had become a husband and father, whose greatest satisfaction came not from personal vindication, but from building a future worthy of the family who had chosen to trust him. The storm clouds that had once darkened his horizon had given way to clear skies and fair winds, carrying them toward adventures they would face together. The hurricane struck with the sudden fury that made Caribbean storms legendary among sailors. What had begun as a routine patrol off the coast of Hispaniola transformed into a battle for survival as 90-mile-per-hour winds and mountainous seas tested every skill James Sterling had learned in 2 decades at sea. "All hands secure for heavy weather," Connor Walsh shouted above the howling wind, his voice barely audible even through the speaking trumpet. The crew of HMS Intrepid moved with practiced efficiency, but the storm had intensified beyond normal preparations. In their cabin below, Isabella held Emma tightly as the ship pitched and rolled with sickening violence. The elegant furnishings that had made their quarters comfortable were now secured or removed, leaving only essential items lashed down against the hurricane's assault. "Is Papa James going to be all right?" Emma asked, her young face pale with fear as another massive wave crashed over the deck above them. "Your father is the finest sailor in the Caribbean," Isabella replied firmly, though her own anxiety was difficult to hide. "He's weathered storms much worse than this." The lie came easily, born of necessity. In truth, Isabella had never experienced anything approaching this hurricane's violence, and she knew from the strain in James's voice during his last visit to their cabin that even his considerable experience was being tested to its limits. Above deck, James clung to the wheel alongside the helmsman as they fought to keep the frigate's bow pointed into the massive waves. To turn broadside to seas this size would mean certain destruction, but maintaining their heading required constant vigilance as the hurricane's winds tried to push them off course. Captain Lieutenant Morrison struggled across the tilting deck, his face streaming with rain and spray. The foremast is showing stress fractures. The rigging may not hold much longer. James squinted through the driving rain, studying the towering mast that carried their most critical sail. Even in the dim stormlight, he could see the ominous cracks spreading through the heavy timber. If the foremast failed, they would lose the maneuverability necessary to survive. "Get Walsh and a repair crew up there," James ordered. "We need to reinforce those fractures before they spread." Morrison's eyes widened with disbelief. "Sir, in these conditions, sending men aloft is suicide, and losing the foremast is certain death for everyone aboard," James replied grimly. "I'll lead the repair crew myself." As James prepared to climb into the rigging with cables and emergency timbers, he thought of Isabella and Emma below, trusting him to bring them safely through this nightmare. The weight of that responsibility drove him upward through wind and rain that tried to tear him from the ropes. The work of reinforcing the damaged mast took 3 hours that felt like 3 years, with James and his volunteers struggling against the hurricane's violence, while suspended 60 feet above a deck that pitched like a wild horse. Twice, crew members nearly fell to their deaths, saved only by safety lines and the quick reflexes of their shipmates. Below in the cabin, Isabella had arranged makeshift bedding in the most protected corner, trying to shield Emma from the worst of the ship's violent motion. But when a particularly massive wave struck the Intrepid with the force of a colliding mountain, even their secure hiding place couldn't prevent disaster. The impact threw Isabella across the cabin, her head striking the heavy wooden beam that supported the deck above. She felt a moment of searing pain. Then darkness claimed her as Emma's frightened screams seemed to fade into the distance. Emma knelt beside her unconscious mother, tears streaming down her face as she tried to wake Isabella with small, gentle hands. The ship continued its violent dance with the hurricane, and Emma realized with the terrible clarity that sometimes came to children in crisis that she was utterly alone. But Emma Sterling was no ordinary child. She had been raised by a naval intelligence officer, trained by a pirate captain, and loved by a mother who had survived betrayal and loss. Drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, Emma began to tend her mother's injury with the basic medical knowledge Isabella had taught her. When James finally made it back to their cabin after securing the foremast repairs, he found Emma keeping vigil over Isabella with a maturity that broke his heart even as it filled him with pride. The child had fashioned a cold compress from torn fabric and seawater and had managed to stop the bleeding from Isabella's head wound. "Papa James," Emma whispered when she saw him. "Mommy won't wake up, but she's still breathing. I've been taking care of her like she taught me." James knelt beside Isabella's still form, checking her pulse with the practiced efficiency of a man who had tended many injuries at sea. The head wound was serious but not life-threatening, and her breathing remained steady despite her unconscious. "You did everything exactly right, Emma," James said softly, gathering both his wife and daughter into his arms. "Your mother would be so proud of how brave you've been." As the hurricane continued to rage around them, James held his family close and made a silent promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would prove worthy of their trust and love. Isabella's eyes fluttered open 3 days later in the Naval Hospital at Port Royal, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer shook with hurricane violence. The first thing she saw was Emma's relieved face, the child having maintained a constant vigil despite James's gentle attempts to coax her away for rest. "Mummy." Emma threw her small arms around Isabella's neck with careful tenderness, mindful of the bandages wrapped around her mother's head. "The doctor said you might sleep for a very long time, but I knew you would come back to us." Isabella winced as she tried to sit up, her head throbbing with the aftermath of her injury, but her heart swelled with gratitude for her daughter's devotion. "I would never leave you, sweetheart. Never." James entered the hospital room carrying a tray of tea and Emma's favorite biscuits, his face showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights spent alternating between caring for his family and managing the Intrepid storm repair. When he saw Isabella's open eyes, his own filled with tears, he didn't try to hide. "Welcome back," he said softly, setting down the tray to take her hand in both of his. "You gave us quite a scare." Isabella asked, her naval officer's daughter, instincts demanding information about their vessel's condition. "Battered but seaworthy," James replied with a weary smile. "We lost the mizzen topmast and took some damage to the hull. But Walsh has the repairs well in hand. More importantly, we saved everyone. Not a single life lost. Thanks in no small part to a very brave little girl who took excellent care of her mother." Emma beamed with pride at this praise, then grew serious as she remembered something important. "Mommy, while you were sleeping, Papa James taught me how to splice rope and calculate drift compensation. And the doctor let me help change your bandages because I was very careful and gentle." Isabella marveled at how the crisis had accelerated Emma's development, forcing the child to display capabilities that might have remained hidden for years under normal circumstances. The hurricane had tested their entire family, revealing strengths none of them had fully recognized. "Dr. says you should make a complete recovery," James continued, "but you'll need several weeks of rest before you're fully yourself again." Isabella nodded, then frowned as she noticed something different about James's appearance. His naval uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, and his normally precise military bearing showed signs of unusual relaxation. "James, why aren't you in uniform? Shouldn't you be with the ship?" James exchanged a meaningful look with Emma, who nodded as if they had discussed this moment extensively during Isabella's unconsciousness. "I've submitted my resignation to the Admiralty," James said quietly, "effective immediately upon your full recovery." Isabella stared at him in shock. "But why? Your career, your reinstatement, everything we worked for." "The hurricane made me realize something important," James interrupted gently. "When I thought I might lose you, when I saw Emma taking care of you with such courage and devotion, I understood that my family is more important than any career, no matter how satisfying or respectable." Emma climbed carefully onto the bed beside Isabella, settling against her mother's side with the natural ease of a child who had been deeply frightened and was now reassured by physical closeness. "Papa James says we're going to start a school," Emma announced with excitement. "A special school where children can learn about ships and navigation and languages, like I've been learning." Isabella looked between her husband and daughter, trying to process this dramatic change in their carefully planned future. "A school." James pulled a chair close to the bed and leaned forward with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered his true calling. "The Caribbean needs education. Isabella, there are children throughout these islands whose parents work in maritime trades but who have no access to proper schooling. We could establish something unique, combining traditional education with practical seamanship and navigation skills." The vision he painted was compelling. Isabella could see it clearly. A school that would prepare young people for the modern world while honoring the maritime heritage that defined Caribbean life. It would be challenging work, but work that could benefit countless families across the islands. "And the funding for such an undertaking?" Isabella asked practically. James smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had thought through every detail. "Thomas's recovered funds, combined with my naval prize money and Commodore Harrison's enthusiastic endorsement, will provide more than adequate resources. The Admiralty is even willing to provide surplus equipment and books." Emma bounced slightly with excitement. "And I get to be the first student. Papa James says I can help teach the younger children basic knots and compass reading." Isabella felt tears of joy and gratitude spring to her eyes as she realized that James had found a way to transform their personal crisis into an opportunity to serve something larger than themselves. The school would allow them to remain together while contributing meaningfully to their adopted community. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice filled with determination despite her physical weakness. 15 years later, Captain Emma Sterling stood on the quarterdeck of her merchant vessel Rising Dawn, watching the familiar outline of Jamaica emerge from the morning haze. At 25, she possessed her mother's keen intelligence and her adoptive father's natural command presence, combined with a confidence that was entirely her own. The ship beneath her feet represented the culmination of everything her parents had taught her. Built in the Sterling Maritime Academy's own shipyard, the Rising Dawn served as both a working merchant vessel and a floating classroom where advanced students learned practical seamanship under Emma's expert guidance. Signal from the harbor captain reported her first mate Michael Walsh, Connor's eldest son, who had grown up alongside Emma in the unusual community that had sprung up around the Sterling Academy. Port Authority grants permission to dock at the Academy's private wharf. Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the bustling harbor with professional assessment. Port Royal had grown dramatically over the past 15 years, but the Sterling Maritime Academy remained its most distinctive feature. What had begun as James and Isabella's dream of educating Caribbean youth had evolved into the most respected maritime institution in the Western Hemisphere. As the Rising Dawn approached the familiar docks, Emma could see the Academy's newest building nearing completion, a massive structure that would house their expanded navigation department and library. Students from across the Caribbean and beyond came to study there, drawn by the unique combination of practical seamanship and scholarly excellence that defined the Sterling approach to education. "There they are," Michael said with a smile, pointing toward the dock, where two figures waited with the patience of people who had watched countless ships arrive over the years. James Sterling, now 57 and distinguished by silver threading through his dark hair, stood with his arm around Isabella's waist. At 52, Isabella retained the elegant bearing that had first captured a pirate captain's attention, though her hands now bore the ink stains of someone who spent her days writing textbooks and correspondence with maritime academies around the world. Emma felt the familiar surge of love and gratitude that always accompanied her homecomings. These two people had given her not just a family, but a purpose and the skills to achieve anything she set her mind to accomplish. The docking procedure went smoothly, testament to the crew's training and Emma's leadership. As soon as the gangplank was secured, Emma strode down to embrace her parents with the enthusiasm of someone who had been away too long. "How was the voyage to Charleston?" Isabella asked, stepping back to study Emma's face with the careful attention of a mother who worried despite her daughter's obvious competence. "Profitable and educational," Emma replied with satisfaction. "We delivered the Carolina Rice Merchant's cargo without incident, and I was able to arrange contracts for 3 more of our graduates to serve as navigators on merchant vessels." James beamed with pride at this news. One of the Academy's greatest successes had been placing its graduates in positions throughout the Caribbean maritime community, creating a network of skilled professionals who shared common training and values. "And the other matter?" James asked quietly, referring to the real reason for Emma's voyage north. Emma's expression grew more serious as she reached into her coat and withdrew an official document bearing impressive seals. "The United States Navy has formally accepted our proposal. Starting next year, the Sterling Maritime Academy will provide advanced navigation training for American naval officers, with full recognition from the Naval Academy at Annapolis." Isabella gasped with delight at this news. Recognition from major naval powers had been a long-term goal, validation that their educational methods were not just effective locally, but worthy of international respect. "There's more," Emma continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "They've asked me to captain the first joint training expedition, a 3-month voyage that will combine American naval cadets with our advanced students for practical experience in Caribbean waters." As they walked toward the Academy's main building, Emma marveled at how completely her parents had transformed, not just their own lives, but the lives of countless young people who had passed through these halls. The Sterling Maritime Academy had become more than an educational institution. It was a community dedicated to excellence, integrity, and service. Emma, Isabella said as they approached the main building, where dozens of students were engaged in their afternoon practical exercises. There's something your father and I have been discussing, something we'd like your opinion about. Emma looked between her parents, noting a particular quality in their expressions that suggested important news. The Admiralty has approached us about establishing a sister institution in Nasser, James explained. They're offering substantial funding and official recognition, but it would require one of us to relocate and oversee the new academy's development. Emma understood immediately what they were asking. At 25, she had proven herself as both an educator and a ship's captain. The natural next step would be taking responsibility for expanding their family's legacy to serve an even broader community. Looking out over the harbor where her own journey had begun, with a frightened child's plea for help, Emma Sterling smiled with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. "When do we start?"